He cleared billions in debt without asking the IMF. No begging, no bailouts, no permission from the West. Just one bold decision. When Trump returned to office and punished Africa with crushing import taxes, one African leader responded, not with outrage, but with action. And what Captain Ibrahim Traoré did next changed everything. When Donald Trump was re-elected President of the United States, his administration quickly turned to one of its most controversial promises, punishing foreign economies, especially African nations, through massive import tariffs and deportation policies. African leaders remained silent, unwilling to challenge the world's most powerful economy, all but one. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, leader of Burkina Faso, stood alone and firm. Instead of issuing complaints or calling for international support, Traoré did something no one expected. He paid off nearly $5 billion in national debt without a single loan from the West. No negotiations with the IMF, no deals with the World Bank, no appeals to the EU. Just a sovereign move that sent shockwaves through the global system. For a small, landlocked country often labeled among the world's poorest, this was more than a financial act. It was political defiance. Burkina Faso was not supposed to do this. According to the established global script, African nations must borrow, depend, and obey. But Traoré tore that script apart. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for approval. He simply decided, we will do it our way. The announcement came in 2024 from Prime Minister Dr. Apollo Kailam Diabe. Burkina Faso had wiped out $4.79 billion in domestic debt. But how? Without external help. The country launched an unprecedented internal campaign calling on citizens, banks, and local businesses to invest in their own future. Government bonds were sold not to Wall Street, but to local farmers, shopkeepers, and teachers, everyday people. It wasn't just about raising money, it was about restoring pride. In a world where African leadership is often framed as dependent or corrupt, Traoré built something different. Trust. The people believed, they invested, and slowly debt turned into ownership. Faith became fuel. While Western institutions waited for failure, Burkina Faso proved them wrong, igniting a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Burkina Faso did something few believed was even possible. It asked its own people to help pay down the national debt, and they answered. While most governments rely on foreign loans with strings attached, this time the solution came from within. The government launched a bold initiative to sell national bonds directly to domestic banks, pension funds, businesses, and ordinary citizens. These were not empty promises or vague dreams. Traoré's administration was transparent. They presented detailed plans, numbers, and projections. They showed people where the debt stood and exactly how they planned to eliminate it. That honesty changed everything. Confidence grew. In a region plagued by instability, where external investors often pull out at the first sign of trouble, Burkina Faso's own population stepped in. Instead of fleeing, they invested. Instead of doubt, they showed faith. Not because they were ordered to one, but because they finally believed someone in power was telling them the truth. The leadership didn't rely on slogans or fear. They offered ownership, purpose, and the possibility of a shared national victory. And to build trust further, they backed these bonds with something very real: gold. Burkina Faso sits atop significant gold reserves, and Traoré used this fact to support the bond initiative. This wasn't abstract nationalism. It was economics rooted in tangible value. By tying bond repayment to gold revenues, the government reassured investors that they weren't funding a fantasy. They were funding a future built on real assets. And the people listened. The campaign didn't just raise capital, it sparked a cultural shift. In towns and cities, conversations changed. Suddenly, the talk was about development, about pride, about building something lasting. The country's energy shifted. What began as a response to foreign hostility evolved into a national awakening. From shopkeepers to students, from farmers to factory owners, people saw themselves not as victims of global finance, but as the authors of their own destiny. And behind it all stood a government that refused to bend. While Western powers imposed sanctions, froze aid, and pressured them to conform, Traore's team doubled down. They didn't cut spending blindly. They didn't fire teachers or shutter hospitals to meet foreign conditions. Instead, they built roads, energy systems, schools, infrastructure that would outlast any economic cycle. They turned debt into development. They showed that independence isn't just a word, it's a strategy, one that begins when a people believe in their own strength. What happened next defied every expectation. Burkina Faso's economic gamble turned into a national triumph. While the international press remained skeptical and Western think tanks predicted collapse, the bond initiative exceeded all projections. Money poured in from inside the country, from everyday people who had never before seen themselves as financial stakeholders. Women in rural, it's pooled savings to buy small bonds. Teachers contributed portions of their salaries. Even retired workers, once forgotten by economic reforms, returned to participate in this rare moment of collective action. The government introduced flexible bond options, making it easy for citizens to choose what they could afford, whether it was $50 or $5,000. There was no elitism, no exclusion, only inclusion. For the first time in decades, national development felt personal. It felt possible. And this was no accident. The Traoré administration understood that economic stability required more than just smart policy. It required belief. And belief grows when people are treated as partners, not as pawns. By investing in their own government, citizens reclaimed a form of power long denied to them by decades of foreign dependency. And it didn't stop at bond sales. Inspired by the public response, businesses began partnering with the state on major infrastructure projects. Local construction firms, utility providers, even small engineering startups joined national efforts to rebuild roads, upgrade power systems, and improve transportation networks. These were not contracts handed out to multinational corporations with offices in Paris or New York. They were given to Burkinabe hands, Burkinabe minds, and Burkinabe ideas. Every kilometer of road laid down was a statement, not just of progress, but of defiance. This wasn't just about paying back old debt. It was about building a nation strong enough never to fall into that trap again. And yet, behind the scenes, pressure mounted. The West watched nervously. Burkina Faso was rewriting the rules, and that made them dangerous, not because of weapons or conflict, but because of what they represented, a functioning African model of self-reliance. So foreign funding was pulled, sanctions were imposed. The usual development grants vanished. It was the same old punishment pattern aimed at forcing submission. But Traoré's government stood tall. They turned every threat into fuel. The more pressure they faced, the more determined they became. In the silence left by departing donors, they heard only opportunity. No more waiting, no more asking. They were building their future on their terms. As Burkina Faso pushed forward with its revolutionary path, the rest of the world struggled to comprehend what was unfolding. A country that had long been dismissed as economically fragile was now attracting the curiosity of economists and political observers alike. How could a landlocked West African nation without vast oil reserves or powerful allies eliminate billions in debt while expanding its infrastructure and maintaining political cohesion? The answer was as uncomfortable as it was undeniable, because they chose not to follow the rules written by foreign powers. Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his administration had identified a dangerous illusion, one that had trapped many African nations for decades. The illusion that survival depended on aid, that progress required permission, and that debt was just the cost of belonging to the global economic system. By rejecting that model, Burkina Faso didn't just cancel debt. They canceled the script. But such defiance does not go unnoticed. International financial institutions began issuing subtle warnings. Risk assessments on Burkina Faso were downgraded. Foreign investors were advised to wait and see. But inside the country, the atmosphere was electric. People were no longer spectators to their own national story. They were participants. Farmers formed cooperatives to manage local food supply chains. Artisans began exporting goods through government-backed platforms. Small manufacturing hubs sprang up near cities that were once forgotten. And behind this surge was a government that refused to treat its people as liabilities. Instead, they were seen as the country's greatest asset. For too long, African governments had been told to privatize, to outsource, to shrink public institutions in exchange for loans that came with political demands. Burkina Faso did the opposite. It strengthened its public sector. It empowered local banks instead of opening the floodgates to international ones. It poured investment into rural regions, refusing to let progress be confined to capital cities. In response, the people gave something rare in today's political world: trust. Not blind loyalty, but informed belief. They saw roads being paved, clinics being built, schools reopening with better pay for teachers. They saw development not as a promise for tomorrow, but as a reality of today. And while international donors continued to withhold support, Burkina Faso's domestic engine kept turning. Gold revenues were stabilized. Regional trade agreements were strengthened with neighboring countries like Mali and Niger. And although these nations, too, faced isolation for rejecting Western military influence, they began to coordinate in ways that had never been attempted before. A new alliance was forming, not one based on foreign doctrine, but on shared survival and dignity. In every village, the change was visible. Water pumps that had sat broken for years were finally repaired. Solar projects provided reliable electricity to regions untouched by national grids. Women-led businesses received microloans from new public banks established to prioritize social impact over profit. The transformation wasn't perfect, and challenges remained. Armed groups still threatened border regions. Inflation needed to be managed, and political pressure from external actors continued to loom. But the difference now was unmistakable. Burkina Faso had moved from reaction to action, from dependency to determination. While the world watched in disbelief, Burkina Faso continued its bold experiment in sovereignty. The message had begun as a financial maneuver quickly evolved African into countries are not passive recipients of charity. For decades, African nations had been conditioned to measure success by their relationships with Western donors, and they are tired of waiting by how much aid they received or how compliant they remained in the eyes of global institutions. But now a different metric was emerging: self-belief. The government didn't just build roads, it built narratives. It changed the way citizens saw themselves and their nation. Media campaigns highlighted local heroes, engineers designing solar farms, women leading agricultural cooperatives, young people returning from cities to rebuild their hometowns. For the first time in living memory, the concept of national pride was no longer hollow rhetoric. It was real, tangible, visible. In government buildings across the country, policies were being reimagined with a single principle in mind: dignity over dependency. No more budget cuts demanded by foreign lenders. No more austerity in exchange for structural adjustment. Instead, Burkina Faso made daring moves, doubling teacher salaries, removing user fees at rural health clinics, funding local food production to reduce reliance on imports. And each step was met not with resistance from the people, but with support. These decisions weren't based on abstract economic models crafted in distant capitals. They were informed by the lived realities of citizens. The people weren't asked to sacrifice in silence. They were invited to help design the recovery. Town hall meetings became standard practice. Ministers toured villages not to lecture, but to listen. Policy became participatory, and through this, the social fabric began to mend. Communities once divided by class, tribe, or geography started working together under a common identity: Burkinabe. Still, the pressure from outside did not stop. International media began framing Traoré's government as populist, authoritarian, even dangerous. Headlines questioned the legality of his actions. Reports accused him of undermining democracy. But inside the country, the picture was different. Elections were planned. Civic spaces were protected. And most importantly, people felt they were finally being heard. The government's legitimacy didn't come from foreign validation. It came from results. And the results spoke louder than any press release. Inflation was slowing. Youth unemployment, though still high, was decreasing. National reserves were stabilizing. All of this without begging a single donor for help. In fact, many in the diaspora began returning. Skilled professionals who had once fled the country for lack of opportunity now saw a reason to come back. Doctors, architects, business consultants, all eager to contribute to a movement that felt historic. They were not returning for money alone. They were returning for meaning. They saw what the rest of the world was still refusing to admit, that something rare was happening in Burkina Faso. A country was writing its own story, with its own ink, on its own terms. And in doing so, it was challenging an entire system built on the assumption that Africa must always follow, never lead. But Traoré wasn't trying to impress the world. He was trying to inspire his people, to show them that the chains they'd been told were permanent could in fact be broken. That sovereignty was not a fantasy. It was a decision, a hard one, a costly one, but one worth making, if only to remind the next generation that they were born free. In the corridors of power from Brussels to Washington, the success of Burkina Faso triggered unease. Analysts, diplomats, and financial strategists quietly asked themselves the same uncomfortable question. What if this model spreads? What if other African countries decide to stop negotiating with institutions that have long controlled the continent's development path? What if they realize they don't need to ask for permission? Traoré's actions didn't just challenge economic orthodoxy. They questioned the very legitimacy of a global system built on debt, dependency, and conditional aid. The silence from Western leaders was telling. There were no congratulations, no acknowledgments, no statements of support. Instead, Burkina Faso found itself increasingly isolated in the official channels of global diplomacy. Sanctions were expanded. Aid programs were suspended. Development partnerships were frozen. These weren't simply punitive gestures. They were warnings, carefully calculated moves to send a message to the rest of Africa. Don't follow this path. But the message fell flat, because in the streets of Bamako, Niamey, and even Lagos, whispers were turning into conversations. If Burkina Faso could fund its own future, why couldn't others? If one small country could mobilize its people, its businesses, and its resources to clear billions in debt, what was stopping Nigeria or Senegal or the Democratic Republic of Congo? The question wasn't rhetorical, it was revolutionary. And Traoré knew it. That's why his government invested not only in infrastructure, but in ideology. National radio stations aired stories of self-made communities. Public schools taught history through the lens of sovereignty and self-determination. And civil servants were retrained to serve not as gatekeepers of bureaucracy, but as facilitators of grassroots change. The goal wasn't just to fix a broken system, it was to replace it entirely. To do that, Burkina Faso had to confront one of its most difficult challenges: trust. Generations of corruption and exploitation had taught people to expect betrayal from those in power. Traoré's team responded not with promises, but with transparency. Budgets were made public. Procurement contracts were published online. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. Corrupt officials, no matter how loyal, were removed without ceremony. Because in this new order, loyalty to the people came before loyalty to power. And that shift was felt everywhere. In small towns where new water pipelines were being laid, in rural clinics where medicine was finally stocked, in vocational training centers where unemployed youth learned trades that actually matched the country's needs. Development wasn't measured in donor reports. It was measured in lived experience. And those experiences began to change the national psyche. No longer passive, no longer cynical, the people began to believe not just in Traoré, but in themselves. They saw, perhaps for the first time, that the struggle wasn't just for economic independence, but for psychological liberation. That true freedom doesn't come from being debt-free. It comes from knowing you have the right to build, to decide, to lead. And so Burkina Faso continued, not as a miracle, not as a utopia, but as proof. Proof that with courage, clarity, and conviction, even the most underestimated nation can rise and force the world to watch. The ripples of Burkina Faso's transformation were no longer confined within its borders. Across the Sahel and beyond, regional leaders began to take notice. What Traoré had accomplished was no longer dismissed as a symbolic gesture or short-term bravado. It was a functioning model, a blueprint for autonomy in a continent long conditioned to wait for outside validation. In Mali and Niger, both facing similar isolation from Western donors due to military transitions, leaders opened talks with Burkina Faso on joint economic corridors, energy sharing initiatives, and regional currency reforms. For the first time in decades, African nations weren't gathering at international summits to beg for aid. They were meeting among themselves to discuss how to operate without it. These weren't secret meetings held in luxury hotels sponsored by think tanks. They were grounded discussions held in local halls, farmer cooperatives, and engineering classrooms. The vision was clear: build an Africa-centered economy, not one tethered to the whims of foreign creditors. And though the Western media ignored these developments, labeling them as unstable or unstrategic, something irreversible was already underway. Youth movements from Senegal to Chad began citing Traoré in their speeches. University students debated not how to migrate, but how to return and rebuild. For once, dignity became more powerful than desperation. But within the institutions that once managed Africa's economic destiny, alarm bells were ringing. The IMF quietly issued new warnings about the rising risk of fragmentation in West Africa. Policy papers were drafted, urging donor nations to re-engage African partners with incentives and stronger conditionality. But it was too late. Burkina Faso had exposed the truth that no amount of public relations could bury. The systems designed to help had become systems that controlled. For decades, foreign loans had come with fine print: cut public spending, privatize essential services, liberalize markets for external corporations. These policies didn't lift countries out of poverty. They simply turned sovereignty into collateral. And now, one nation had said no. Not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. And that no echoed far louder than any declaration of independence ever had. Within Burkina Faso, this new clarity continued to shape national priorities. Public procurement was restructured to favor local production. Strategic sectors like agriculture, mining, and energy were reorganized under joint public-private models with strict transparency laws. Every step was intentional. Every policy had a purpose: to ensure that no future generation would grow up believing that the path to progress lay through the gates of foreign approval. In this new era, success was not measured in international praise, but in national resilience. The people began to see development not as a gift, but as a right. Children in rural areas now studied by solar-powered lights. Women once excluded from financial systems now led microcredit banks. Young engineers started to design irrigation systems that work for their soil, not for export crops dictated by European markets. And behind it all was a government that, despite pressure, threats, and economic isolation, refused to blink. They weren't asking to be admired. They weren't begging to be included. They were building, quietly, consistently, confidently. And the world, whether it wanted to or not, was starting to look. As Burkina Faso's quiet revolution gained momentum, a deeper and far more dangerous question began to surface. What if the current global economic order that was never meant to serve nations like Burkina Faso in the first place? What if debt, aid, and foreign dependency weren't failures of the system, but its intended design? These weren't conspiracy theories. They were truths hiding in plain sight, truths that Captain Ibrahim Traoré's leadership began to expose. For years, African nations had been praised for achieving stability when they followed IMF policies, even as inequality grew and public services collapsed. They were labeled partners in development when they signed lopsided trade agreements that drained resources and locked them into perpetual raw material exports. The metrics of success were twisted, measured not by how well a country served its people, but by how well it served the system. But Burkina Faso rejected that game entirely, and in doing so it became a mirror held up to the world. The mirror showed the uncomfortable contradictions of Western foreign policy, how nations could speak of democracy while freezing aid to a people trying to survive, how banks could demand austerity from the poor while bailing out billionaires at home, how sovereignty was encouraged only when it didn't threaten someone else's profit margins. And in that reflection, many in the global South began to see their own realities. Burkina Faso's refusal to bend was not just about pride. It was about survival, about reclaiming the right to exist with dignity. The debt they repaid wasn't just financial. It was generational, emotional, psychological. It was the weight of being told for decades that without help, they were nothing, that without permission, they would fail. And now that myth was collapsing. One country at a time, people were waking up, not through violence, not through revolution in the traditional sense, but through clarity, through a new understanding that true power comes not from handouts, but from internal strength, from communities that invest in themselves, from governments that trust their own people more than foreign advisors. And while Burkina Faso still faced enormous challenges, threats at its borders, climate instability, economic volatility, it now faced them on its own feet. Not kneeling, not begging, but standing. That posture alone sent tremors through global institutions. Because if Burkina Faso could stand, others might follow. And if enough followed, the entire foundation of global finance, built on control, conditionality, and compliance, might begin to crack. This is what made Traoré's actions so powerful. Not that he had solved every problem, not that he had created paradise, but that he had proven something far more dangerous to those in power, that alternatives are possible, that the scripts written in Washington, Paris, and London are not the only paths to development, that Africa can think, plan, and act for itself. And most terrifying of all, for those who had grown rich off its struggle, that Africa might finally believe in its own strength. Inside Burkina Faso, the momentum only grew. Public workshops were held on constitutional reform. Citizens debated how to lock self-reliance into future generations. Youth parliaments emerged, mimicking government structures to train future leaders. This wasn't propaganda, it was preparation. A people getting ready to never be caught off guard again, to never again trade freedom for funds, to never again accept the idea that dignity must be borrowed. And so, as the rest of the world watched in silence or skepticism, Burkina Faso built in broad daylight, not just bridges and roads, but a new narrative, one where Africa was no longer a problem to be solved, but a force to be reckoned with. Burkina Faso's journey is not a fairy tale. It is not a polished PR campaign or a perfectly executed plan. It is raw, imperfect, human, and that's what makes it powerful. Captain Ibrahim Traoré never promised a flawless future. What he offered was something far more honest, the right to choose their own path, even if it meant struggle. And the people accepted that offer not with blind loyalty, but with open eyes. They understood the risks. They knew what it meant to defy the global order. But they also knew what it meant to continue living under it. For decades, Africa has been told it must wait. Wait for aid, wait for investment, wait for reforms, wait for approval. But waiting never brought freedom. It brought more debt, more broken promises, more external interference disguised as help. Burkina Faso said enough, and that act alone rewrote the narrative. Not just for one country, but for an entire continent tired of being spoken for. There are those who will continue to dismiss this moment. They will point to Burkina Faso's GDP, to its security challenges, to its isolation from Western alliances. They will say it's unsustainable, unrealistic, doomed to fail. But those critics miss the point. This is not just about economics. This is about psychology, about memory, about reclaiming the stolen belief that Africans cannot govern themselves without foreign guidance. It is about taking back the dignity that was traded away in every loan agreement signed in desperation. Burkina Faso may not have all the answers, but they have finally asked the right questions. What does it mean to be sovereign? What does it mean to build a nation not in someone else's image, but in your own? What happens when a country refuses to let its future be decided in boardrooms an ocean away? These questions are now echoing far beyond Ouagadougou. They are being whispered in coffee shops in Accra, discussed in classrooms in Kinshasa, debated in parliament halls in Nairobi. Traoré's decision to wipe out the debt was never just about numbers. It was about making a statement that survival without submission is possible, that pride and policy can coexist, that liberation, real liberation, doesn't come with conditions. And yes, the road ahead remains uncertain. Threats are real. Isolation is real, mistakes will be made. But for the first time in a generation, a country has stepped out of line and refused to step back. They are not asking for the world's applause. They are demanding the world's attention. Because something fundamental has changed. A nation that once borrowed to survive now builds to thrive. A people once divided by foreign agendas now unite under their own vision. And a continent that was told to wait is finally beginning to move. Not perfectly, not easily, but purposefully. And in that movement lies the most powerful truth of all, that the future of Africa does not belong to donors, to bankers, or to foreign presidents. It belongs to Africans, to those who dare to dream not of imitation, but of independence. Burkina Faso has dared. The question now is, who will follow?